As Dennis said, I'm one of 4 on the coast, and my role basically is to assist schools to assist students make smooth transitions from school to adult life within the community. So we're really about providing information, about helping with those planning processes, and unofficially, officially we don't advocate, I suppose, within our role, but unofficially there is an advocacy role within and outside the system, because as people move through, they need access to options and services, whether it be at school or within the community. So as Dennis said, I've been there since about 1990, and we started a lot of things, and it's been a lot of action research over those years, and it lines up very well with Kohler's taxonomy, which I think was around 1993?
96, I think.
96, was it?
Somewhere
in the 90s. Okay. And just as far as the presentation goes, I'd rather that you just put your hand up or interrupt me as we go through, rather than leaving questions to the end. If there's something you're unclear on, if there's something you want to query or something you don't agree with, I've got reasonably broad shoulders. I don't mind being challenged. You might come up with something I haven't thought of, or we haven't thought of, which is going to help us as well. But I hope you find this reasonably informative. At the end of the presentation, I hope you have a decent understanding of just the bones of our model. I want to give that to you first, the bones of our model, so you can see then how we do our planning and how we put students and their families at the centre of it. So if you walk out of here with a decent understanding about how the Gold Coast goes about doing this as one example of a model, and also some of the resources we use to achieve that, then I think I will have achieved what I've set out to. Okay, we've already talked about that. There's lots of transitions, and quite often it's important we identify which one. Of course, we're talking here about the transition to post-school life. And I often think of students on a continuum, and they're going to move through and they're going to transition, whether that transition's a good one or a bad one. And the challenge for us as educators is to make that transition a good one and to reflect the hopes and aspirations of the individual. So as I said, there's a couple of things here that I want to speak about. The first, the key elements of the model very briefly, and then we're going to focus on facilitating the transition. We use 2 terms. The current term is Senior Education and Training Plan. Every student at Year 10 has a set plan, what we call a set plan, that guides them through the senior phase of learning. So everyone in Queensland has one of those plans put in place at Year 10 level. Some of the special schools are doing them in Year 11 because the students will be there until they've had one extension, in other words 3 years of senior, or Year 13 you could say unofficially. And then looking also at international best practice, and just quickly looking at how the two line up with what we do. Sorry, Dennis. Personal Future Action Plan. PFAP. So some schools will call them PFAP. Every student in a high school will have a set plan, which has anybody seen a set plan and what they look like in the high school setting? They could vary from a 1-pager to a 2-pager to a 3-pager. It covers subjects, where they're going to go to school. It might cover whether they want to get to traineeship or apprenticeship, etc. Maybe some aspirations. Is that how it sat with the one you saw? That's what it looked like? The PFAP is really, it's a bit like comparing, I suppose, a Commodore to a Maserati. The Commodore might be the set plan. The Maserati is more the PFAP. It's the more detailed, because the student has been identified as requiring support in that transition, then we put a lot more planning in than the basic 1 or 2, 3-pager that the high schools would do. Because, and I won't go into the history, it'd take too much time, but because of I suppose what happened years ago, we had to come up with another name for our plans and not call them transition plans. When we were told to focus on IEPs, we called them personal future action plans in our region, and we got around those issues of not doing transition plans by doing personal future action plans with our regional office approval. So that's why we've got the two, and you quite often see the two terms being used. The PFAP really is part of the set plan, because at the end of a set plan you've got data, and that opens a learning account for a student. And that learning account can stay open until the student's 25, for example, to accrue those points for their QCE, the Queensland Certificate of Education. So Is that okay, Dennis? All right, so I'll keep moving. Looking at the elements of our model. I might put a few of these up to start with. There's a few key elements in the model that we use, and if I go over this quickly, then when we talk a little more about the transition, we talk about the set plans or the PFAPs, it'll make more sense when it sits in context. The first element is that a transition process that is, and it seems obvious, but it's planned. So it does have a set plan, or it does have a personal future action plan. The planning process is empowering for the individual and the family because it relies on the hopes and aspirations of the student and the family and the corresponding long and short-term goals for direction. And we really put that right at the centre. You'll hear me talk a lot about empowerment. I know we talk about in the literature, and we probably talk more academically about self-determination. I generally generalise into empowerment of students and use that term. So we're challenging students to own the plan. If they don't own the plan, what's wrong with it? Let's fix it up. There's been examples where students have ripped their plan up and we've started again. And I think that's fine, but I almost shudder after an hour and a half if someone at the end thinks the plan's terrible. I think, well, how have we got to this point and not realise that? So the challenge through the meeting is to try and help the student own that plan. So at the end of it, they will sign the plan as a starting point to say, yep, I'm committed to that. And then mum and dad sign it and the school signs it. So you've got a combined starting point. And I think that's really positive that can happen. But we give the guarantee at the beginning, if you don't own the plan at the end, then we will put it aside and we will start again. And as I say, we've done we did that 2 or 3 times. We've done it at Beenleigh. We've done it at Southport as well, the ones I can remember. The planning process also is holistic in nature. What's the first environment you think about when you start thinking about planning for the future? There's one that always comes to mind. It's the one that comes up at barbecues and get-togethers at Christmas and Easter. What do parents and aunties always ask young people? What's the question? What was that?
What are you going to study at university?
Yep.
What are you going to do when you leave school?
Yes. What are you going to do if you leave school? What environment are we talking about there? Usually it's the vocational environment, isn't it? Is that the only environment we live in? What are some of the other environments that we live in, those core environments?
Community work.
Yeah, and you could put that broadly under vocation, couldn't you? But I look at it, and I say this to students to probably internalise it easily. It's work, rest and play. There's what you do Monday to Friday in the structured part of your week. There's where you go home to at night, which is rest, and there's play, which is your recreation. And those 3 key environments are the 3 that we focus on. But you can learn or study in each of those environments as well, can't you? So lifelong learning and study comes across those 3. So it's really important that when a plan's put together, that we give students the opportunity to talk about those other environments, and we just don't naturally think that we're going to be talking about vocation. The other point there with vocation that's really important is that it's inclusive. Because if you think of students who've got very high support needs and may go to community participation as opposed to paid employment, then should that be considered recreation? And would that student and that family consider that to be recreational? I would challenge that concept, and what we've created on the Gold Coast is the notion that what you do in the structured part of your week, Monday to Friday, that's your vocation. So a person who's not going to paid work might do a little bit of voluntary work on a Monday. They might go to bowling and canoeing on a Tuesday, and then they might be doing craft on a Wednesday. Now they're structured, that is a structured part of their week. They have to get to activities on time, there's entrance fees, there's expectations and outcomes that will be achieved. Now if that young person bowls on Friday night when the family's had tea and watched the footy or whatever, or before the footy, it gets a bit late, doesn't it, these days? But they might head out to go bowling. I would challenge you to think about that as recreational, but the Monday to Friday bit is the structured part of the week. And if you take that notion, then everyone has a vocation. It's just where it sits on a continuum from non-paid employment options to paid employment options. And at the end of the day, all of us, lecturers, students, myself included, there are only really 2 major or 3 major pathways. Non-paid employment options beyond school, paid employment options, which you guys are heading towards or may already be in, and then you've got people who are doing a bit of both, who may be doing some supported employment and doing community participation as well. Does that notion make sense? Does? Sometimes I get challenged, so I'm waiting for it.
Yeah, just one point, Greg. We sort of kicked off this series of classes by sort of saying, the research we did for Ed Queensland, that a vast majority of students were in non-paid type employments. And I was sort of challenging people to say, hey, we want to try and shift as many people as we can from the non-paid options perhaps into the paid options. But I think it's very interesting you're sort of putting the view that for some people with more significant disabilities, if that non-paid thing is structured, it can create a meaningful life.
Yes, and I think Dennis, and that's a good point, because the assumption I have, and coming from the coast, we're trying to move everyone in terms of their goals towards a positive outcome, and I use that mantra, optimistic but realistic. So there's rigour in what we do. So my natural assumption when I talk to you is the people we're talking about who would head towards a non-paid employment option, or community participation option is probably the more common term used, they have tried voluntary work. They may even do some voluntary work with the aim of hopefully getting into supported employment. But that for them is the starting point. And that's not because it's an easy option, it's because that's in line with their goals, the starting point for those people. And some people with really high support needs, they'll have a great week. I know, yes.
Yeah, I actually, there's a debate there, or a discussion there, because I do, in part of my, I've do a lot of work with Volunteer in Queensland, and certainly there are people there who really would challenge that. In terms of contribution to the community, it can't all be measured by whether you're getting paid for it. And there's that thought there that, and the point that Dennis made, is we actually want to move people into paid employment because somehow that's better than voluntary participation.
So which part of what I was saying do you disagree with?
No, I didn't disagree, guys.
I don't.
But some of those ideas need thinking through. Actually, your inclusive idea of there are three parts of your life sort of thing, actually covers that. But there's certainly some thinking about.
And I suppose in
really
the back of,
interesting.
I'm aware too of my audience, but I'm aware of in other states too where they may, how do I say this tactfully, there may not be the infrastructure in the school to put in place those on-campus and off-campus work experience to really test out where a person sits on the spectrum of preparation for paid employment. So it's a self-fulfilling prophecy when they go through an assessment at the end of school, they automatically get voluntary work and community participation because they're not ready. The real reason they're not ready is because the work wasn't done back here to prepare them. And that is not to stretch people beyond realism. That's just a fact when you sometimes go to some of these expos and hear students speak, and then you compare what we're doing to another state's doing. I sometimes worry that, there could have been more done. And I've got to say that diplomatically. So it's a challenge, isn't it? Because all of us as educators, we're in a privileged position. When you talk about transition education, you think about the impact on the individual that we have. And not only the individual, the family and the relatives as well. And it's not to make people paranoid about making decisions and supporting students, but it is a very, very significant position that we hold when we facilitate those meetings and prompt people to think. Yes?
I'd also like to raise the idea that even people that don't have support needs find it hard to find a job and might go into volunteer roles in order to get paid employment. So it's not, especially with the way the economy is and stuff like that.
Yeah.
So.
And when we look at, and I'm diverting a little bit here, but I think it's important, when we look at community participation, we sort of band it into three areas: voluntary work, social recreational opportunities, and living skill development, just to give a little bit of structure to it. And that again is to try and reinforce that idea. If you're trying to empower people, you imagine going into a supermarket, and I love my cereal because I surf all the time, so I know I'll go get my Wheat Bix and I'll go and get this other one that's got these purple berries in it. I know where they are, I'll price compare, and off I go. So that's a bit like people shopping for options, isn't it? You imagine taking all that cereal aisle and pulling it all over the whole store and trying to find things. Well, that's how options sometimes appear to families. It's just and students. It's overwhelming and all-consuming. So if you can come up with a process which neatly categorises it logically on common sense and allows people to think about some domains of living like vocation and living and social rec, and then learning across those three where necessary. It's a neat way of thinking about it. Then you can start looking at your goals. Then you can start looking at the services of options you might need within those, in effect, those supermarket aisles. So it's again, always making choice. And your point, thank you, your point's important. But making choices, informed choices, that come out of that sort of process where a person knows where they want to go, they're aware of the option, they're looking at what support they'll need, and then the strategy becomes services or other types of natural supports. Okay, so Val, I better not deviate because I better keep going. Holistic, valued by the stakeholders. If you've got a process, you want to make sure it's valued. Who are the stakeholders in a transition process? Please help me out. Yes, if we looked at it as a bullseye, who do you put right in that middle of the bullseye? The student, and who else sits next to them? Parents, carers, those close people. At the next ring, then we've got the educators, haven't we? And we've got people like me at the next ring, the advisory type people, and then you've got the services, and then you've got the networks of services, and then the community. So, but if you look at it from that point of view of having concentric circles and rings, then it's important that people at each of those rings have the necessary level of knowledge. Because if you're a student and Centrelink's an outer ring, and the student comes to the set plan meeting and then goes off to register with Centrelink to try and gain disability support pension, and they get onto an officer at Centrelink who says, oh yeah, you've got a PFAP, have you? How special is that when you get to a government department if someone says, oh, you got a PFAP or a set plan? If someone says that, oh wow, they're on the same page. Immediately there's another Commonwealth Government Department, Human Services, who's aware at least that I've got a plan. So we try to make sure people within the model have an awareness level, and they value the model, but they also have a clear understanding of the roles and responsibilities within that model. So it's a bit like the Sydney Harbour Bridge. We've never had to rebuild it, but we're constantly chipping bits of rust off here and there and painting it, and maybe there's new lights going up and lanes being changed. But that core bridge has always stayed consistent in terms of what I'm speaking about here today. So does that make sense in terms of a process? It's planned, it's empowering, it's holistic, it's valued by those involved, and they understand what they should be doing within the process. That's our first element. Our second element is at school level. It's fine to have a process, but you've got to engage it. So what comes out of our set plans and PFAPs needs to be, if you think about that plan, is it only going to happen at school? Where else should it be? It's a living document. And you all know with learning, if you practice in different environments, no matter what it be, you improve your learning, don't you? You consolidate your learning, attitudes, knowledge, skills, processes. Let's talk it simply about skills or learning. What other environments can this plan live in? Beg your pardon?
Family home.
Yes. They're the two obvious ones, aren't they? School and home. There is a third one too. Sometimes people stay with their grandparents or their aunties, or they have respite, or they travel with scouting groups or other groups. So just thinking more broadly about the environments as well. But just here at the moment we're talking, I've highlighted the school side of it. We used to talk about IEPs, Dennis, many years ago, individual education plans. Now we've got for a special school, for example, we've got individual curriculum plans which are guiding students through in terms of their learning outcomes. There's adjustments for students to the curriculum. There's programs being created to address those long and short-term goals. In the high schools, up until year 10, they'd have an ICP, an individual curriculum plan, and around the probably not quite the adjustments, but they'd have an individual support plan, an ISP as well, which is looking at well-being. And I saw one yesterday where a student wasn't attending, and there were some goals to attend and to be at school by 9 o'clock, and some rationale around that, some structure to try and get the student back on track. If I forget later on, the planning I'm talking about now usually starts at year 10 level, but for those at risk of disengaging, I think a brief plan that gives some direction at Year 9 level can do the world of wonders as well for students. It doesn't have to be super detailed, but if the teacher can... Students can go out to work experience at 14. People will talk about 15 and 14, 9 months. They can go out to work experience at 14. It mightn't fit with school cultures in some instances, but if the student can be put out into a placement safely, sometimes for those at risk to get out, for example, I can remember many years ago into a car wreckers at Slacks Creek, I think it was. Student was pretty much wrecking the school, but once he got out and he went to this car wreckers, all of a sudden he started saying, well, man, I do think I do need to learn to read because I couldn't read the labels that they were talking about, and I do need my basic maths. So when he came back to school from that work experience, he was a changed person. You could see a bit of reason in what he was doing. And what's the other part of that that's important? The other part is that the teachers sit there as paid employees of the education department and listen to the student as an equal and say, well, how can I help you achieve this goal? Okay, we'll try and find 2 or 3 work experiences for you. Time frame, we'll try and get your first one in by 2 weeks, so come and see me. And if we haven't got it by 2, we'll definitely have it by 3. That's such a change around in terms of the student listening to what's going on in that setting. And I'll talk a little more, I suppose, about sometimes the difficulties when we do set plans and the student feeling like the teacher's there and the student's there, and the student must nod and say exactly what the teacher he thinks is in the teacher's mind. So it's a challenge to empower students quite often. Okay, the other thing too is when you've got a range of set plans, then you should have a needs analysis, because you should be able to see where the needs are coming through and create options. I call it transition infrastructure. No one else seems to do that. And it hasn't been picked up, so maybe I'm a bit odd, but we call it transition infrastructure on the Gold Coast. It's what you're putting in place, and it's a bit like a menu at the front of a restaurant. I'm not going to serve everything tonight, but it's there if you want it, and we've got it in the fridge if you need it. So having options that are there, not, oh, we'll have to now create a work experience at the nursing home. Oh, we haven't got a work experience. Having it all sitting there, roles and responsibilities organised, so when you need to utilise it, you can say to the family in the meeting, yep, we're fine to go. We've got a nursery down the road, Jake Smith's nursery, we'll give them a call. How empowering is that to the family when it's not a problem, it's a, yes, we've got it ready, or we can follow it up within a time frame. Okay, the third element, post-school provision. Now, this would be nice if it all worked perfectly, but it doesn't always work perfectly. You would like to have provision that's adequate. And we're talking across those 3 environments, remember, not just vocation. Employment, you could talk for the whole session just on the lack of options that are out there. And I think, Dennis, when you would look at your research, we aren't flush with options. I think that's a fair statement. And the NDIS, I think, will improve. Everyone's aware of National Disability Insurance Scheme? Yes, yeah. Yeah, I think that will make the playing field a little more level in Australia. At the moment, for example, the students in Queensland's exiting, they might be below the 20, going towards community participation, might get below $20,000 a year, yet you go over the border into New South Wales and the highest level over there could be 50,000 plus. So there's an inequity there depending on, the state and historically how those options have been funded. But I think NDIS, and this is not confidential, this is pretty common knowledge about the paucity of options paucity of funding in Queensland. We need variety in service areas because no 2 people are the same. And you look at different values and beliefs. One person will look at an option and say that's great, and another person, depending on their values and beliefs, will look at it and say that's terrible, we're not going anywhere near it. And we don't play God in terms of options that are out there. We promote what's available and what's funded. There are different people who have different philosophies and different service providers who have different philosophies as well. But it's important we show the range of options so that people can make informed choices. You want those options to be responsive to student need, and you want that post-school provision to be cooperative and collaborative as it can be. You want them to work closely with schools. So I always see there's two levels of access to schools. We've in effect got the students that the services want access to and the options want access to. So it's a competitive environment. So we never promote it happens occasionally with good working relationships, but generally we don't promote one service provider over another. For example, in employment, we want them to compete on a good outcomes basis, and we want that talk at barbecues where families meet and talk at school to be around these great outcomes certain services are getting, because then people will go towards those services. Or if services, for example, get up a new option such as driver ed or a resume preparation course or something else, if we keep the services an arm's length, they compete. I mean, there's a much better quality of service out there. But in terms of the access to schools, general information is one level of access. The other level is when they link with an individual as part of their set plan process. And that, I would argue, never comes at the beginning of a meeting. It never comes at the beginning of a plan, unless that service, like might have been the Cerebral Palsy League or FSG Australia, or somebody has been with the individual for many years. Because if you've got the one service in there at the time those goals are set, you're sort of aligning with one service provider. We would argue that you work through on and off campus work experience, you might take courses, you get to a point where you know you need a DES, a disability employment service, you look at the range of services. You may have been at school at a meeting, for example, where the services are spoken as a panel. You may have been to one of our Gold Coast mini expos for vocational mini expos and met with the service providers, but you look at what they can offer you and you make an informed choice. So it's a bit more of an involved process, but it's not if someone needs a DES, okay, Gold Coast Employment will do. It's a much more in-depth sort of process of getting the family and the student to own the goal, to look at the best option to achieve the goal. Does that make sense?
So in Kohler's taxonomy terms, this would equate to interagency collaboration, I imagine. Is that right? And you're advocating that, when it's appropriate, that post-school service providers participate in the planning process.
Yes. Yep. In a timely manner. I think that's what Tom Gibson said in the Moreland report. It should be in a timely manner. So when they're needed. And they're accountable as well. It's holding, students will say to me in our little transition chats that I was talking about earlier to Dennis, these little groups of students that we've got happening around the schools. I'll say, I don't think my DES is really helping. They haven't called me for 2 weeks, 3 weeks. I think I'm going to change. And then I said, well, maybe you should ring the DES and say you're not happy with the fact that you can change, yes, but try and fix it up first if you like the service. And get out your diary and say, can you call me by such and such? If I haven't heard by that Thursday, I'll call you on the Friday. Hold them to account because they're busy and the squeaky wheel gets oil. So it's the Disability Employment Service. Yeah, the Disability Employment Service. Anyone familiar with DESs? No? No, okay. There's two types. You've got DMS, Disability Management Service. I'll Commonwealth Rehabilitation Services. Anybody? Now I'm probably talking about stuff that might have been in the ARC here. No, they were just around to a couple of years ago. But once upon a time, there was a service that helped people who might have had an accident with rehabilitation to get them back into the workforce. So they were quick, quite a focused service and time limited. Well, the Disability Management Service has that sort of role. It's time-limited focus. They might have access to psychologists, to occupational therapists, physiotherapists, specialists with a time limit of helping that person with modifications to the work environment, etc. So that's your Disability Management Services. The other one is the Employment Support Services, or what they call ESS, and they're the ones I generally refer to. They're the services that can find the job, support the person into the job, and then phase the support as the person learns the skills and starts to become more independent. They can also come back when the person needs retraining or might have an issue. Is that okay? So that's our second element. I'm a bit conscious of time here. So so that's basically the process. That's what we do at the school level, and it's what we do in terms of post-school. So they're those three key elements. What I'd like to now move on to, and I suppose it's the main part of the agenda, is to talk about how we create a personal future action plan or a set plan. Before I start on that, there's two words I usually use, and I was thinking this morning how you guys would categorise them into concepts or values or principles, but I always talk about choice and empowerment. They're the two words, and because we have 19 to 20 schools in the area that Vicky and myself service in the Gold Coast. So that's kind of from about Pimpamar through to the Queensland border and out to Mount Tamborine. We have 3 special schools and 17 high schools. So 20 schools. We do the in-service with those schools. We're always sort of trying to get people to think around those terms of putting the student. Remember we talked earlier about putting the student and the family in the centre of the process, and that choice. And I'm not sure how you define it, but I suppose there are principles of operation to a degree, there are values to a degree as well. But choice, if you think about it, a person can empower or be empowered or can take charge of their life if they've got choices. If they're encouraged to make choices, we all do, don't we? We all think of choices we've made that are good and not so good, and the pathways they take us down. But it allows you as an individual to shape your life. So I always talk about choice and empowerment.
I think in Cole's terms, it would be student-focused planning, where you've got the student and family in the middle.
And self-determination. Self-determination. And we do a little, in the checklist I sent you, Dennis, there is a section on self-determination, whether it's standalone or integrated within the curriculum at each school, and people have got to consciously think about where they're addressing that. I was at a high school the other morning. We do a lot of that before school meetings to see how people are going with, because every school in our area has a little transition team, and I meet with that team. We have an action plan to help them develop their infrastructure if they need it, and then we meet to finish the action plan or just to consolidate or to reinforce. And now I lost my track. What was I saying? Just talking about self-determination and getting people to really focus and say, well, are there opportunities in that class yesterday? Were there opportunities where students could have made a choice and then had to live at that consequence of whether it was positive or negative or indifference? How many choices go by at school or at home when people could be making choices and therefore, I think in effect, becoming more empowered. And I think sometimes parents make choices for sons and daughters. I know I've got 5 kids from about 33 down to 18. And, there's times I think it's more convenient and easier sometimes to make the choice and move on when you could have offered that choice. It's being aware of it, I suppose.